People sometimes say our institutions are failing. But what exactly is an institution? Because the institutional economics definition of this is actually kind of different than the way it's often used in regular conversation. So it's worth unpacking the institutional economics perspective on these things. And this is part of my Dragon series, where I'm talking about the way our system, the system as a whole, is acting in kind of pernicious ways. And we're trying to understand the nature of that system. Like, how does it act on top of many, many well-intentioned actors playing a role in the system to do these things that none of those people would intend? Which is not to say that there are no bad actors, but we're just trying to understand the system, how it's working. And what I'd like to do in this video is introduce some institutional economics vocabulary terms, and with each of them sort of talk about ways the dragon uses institutions to accomplish its will. And this discussion should help people understand my approach to the dragon, because there are some things on my channel that might seem weird coming from an economist. Like, I'm very interested in the game theory of moral frames. How do those change and evolve over time? I have a series on the history of free speech, which relates to that. Polarization, contempt, cynicism, these are attitudes oftentimes. And yet they are kind of underpinning the changing nature of the economic structure. Because our economic structure is not staying the same, it's moving. It's moving in a direction that will magnify the power to the powerful dynamic. And it's doing this on the tops of well-intentioned people and the way they think about their different moral frames. So understanding institutional economics will help you understand why the moral frame matters so much for economic foundations. So what is an institution? An institution is the set of rules, roles, norms, and enforcement mechanisms that structure human relationship. So institutions include things like school systems and businesses, but they also include things like marriage and a religious code. Markets are an institution. Family structure is an institution. A school system or an industry or a particular school within a school system, all of those are institutions. And the goal of an institution is really to lift up human behavior and human instinct that is pro-social in some way, and to push down or disincentivize human behavior that's antisocial in a particular context. So to go through a couple of examples, marriage is an institution that has roles, where in some cultures the husband role and the wife role have different expectations, different norms that go into that. In other cultures, maybe it's more even, but a lot of times when you go to premarital counseling, what they have to deal with is the fact that people have different expectations built into what they expect from a marriage partner. And if they expect that being married requires giving your husband or giving your wife a kiss as they leave the house in the morning, and you don't have that particular rule and expectation built into the way you view marriage, then it can create this conflict between people, because they both sort of feel intuitively like the other is breaking the rules, the expectations of that institution. And in a marriage, of course, the enforcement mechanism might just be being grouchy with your spouse, or giving them a frown, or just growing in frustration over time, slowly over time. That could be the enforcement mechanism. It's this socially enforced thing. Whereas you look at a classroom, like my classroom, there are, of course, roles, I'm the teacher role, and expectations about what that role entails. There are rules about behavior in the classroom. You don't talk when the professor is talking. You turn your assignments in on time. And of course, those rules, some of those appear in the syllabus of the classroom, but others are just going to be enforced socially. If somebody tries to talk when I'm talking in the classroom, the peers might sort of give them a frown, or they're going to get a little bit of social judgment. And that's the enforcement mechanism, making sure that people live up to the expectations of the rules and roles in a classroom. With markets, there's a buyer and a seller role, and what are the expectations regarding honesty, what kind of honesty is harshly enforced, what kind of honesty it's kind of expected that you be a little bit dishonest. These are all built into people's norms and expectations. Do you have to accept returns if somebody doesn't like a product and they bring it back? That's a norm that goes into the market. And of course, there isn't just one market. There's many different markets, each with their own set of norms that are built in. Now, if we're going to try to connect this to the dragon and the way the dragon accomplishes its will, we need to have a picture in our heads of what are the tools the dragon can use for its own purposes. And obviously money is going to be a key source of power for the dragon. The dragon essentially is the network of money flows through the system. But it's not just that there's also network power where the dragon operates through these networks of people, each of whom have their own type of power. And some of that might be money power or banking power. Other power people might have their hands on could be technology, like the access to control the rules of the game with digital tools. Or it could be institutional power, like people who have high up roles in government or control over a military or control over, or let's say heavy influence over a university system. All of these are different types of power that are interconnected. And if we want a picture of how our system works, our system is definitely not purely hierarchical with one group or one person at the top. Rather, if you zoom in to the top of the power pyramid in our system, what you get is a network of people, each of whom have their own style of power and their own type of power. But they have to take into account the different power of other actors in the system. And as I've said before, oftentimes these different types of power, they're competing with each other in various ways. But when the interest of the whole system comes and threatens their role of power, they will congeal. They will come together and work in tandem to protect the game they're playing that they enjoy between each other. So we're really imagining the dragon, the head of the dragon or the top of power, as being a network of people with their own dynamics, their own game theory. Now, our first set of vocabulary terms to understand what's going on are going to be institutions of the heart versus official institutions. Where official institutions are the rules, roles, norms, etc., that are actually written down on paper. And of course, increasingly, these can be rules that are written into computer code. And there's lots of different places they can be written down. They can be written down in a constitution, they can be written down in a set of bylaws or in a syllabus. Lots of places, but the official institutions are written down. Institutions of the heart are ones that are sort of built into people's expectations, people's norms, their habits, and they're enforced oftentimes not through some official, yes, this needs to be punished, but through a negative reaction from people if you do the wrong thing, or through more attention or more accolades if you fulfill some kind of expectation. And I will say that the actual vocabulary terms in this book for these are internal and external institutions, but I don't like those. I think those are kind of unnecessarily confusing. So this is the language I will use. And of course, we're trying to build up our understanding of how to approach economics. And anytime we have a binary like this, where it's two terms that are sort of in contrast, what we want to do is we want to develop a strong intuition for how they differ and their different properties. But once we've done that, we want to blend them together because in reality, these things are not separable. These things are absolutely intertwined. So how can the dragon influence institutions of the heart? And obviously, one of the biggest ones is going to be through influence over the public discourse on social media or in digital tool-related spaces. Because, of course, institutions are collectively agreed upon by a group of people or society. And the way that collective agreement happens is through the discourse. It's through the conversation where everybody agrees. So if the digital tools allow some people to have more influence over the direction of that discourse, then that will have an outsized effect. And if you look at the definition of institutions, this is not just about what people think. It's more importantly about what people think other people think, what people believe other people believe. And that is determined primarily in the digital space in the 21st century. So back to the definition of institutions, where do people get their sense of what is normal? Like, what is normal things to think about? What are normal ways of treating people? Perhaps people in a certain group that social media parades as a group that has certain characteristics. What are normal ways of dealing with conflict? What are normal ways of speaking? What are normal behaviors in everyday life? And we get our sense of that largely today through social media, which oftentimes bleeds into the real world, such that even if you have somebody who is not on social media, who doesn't use digital tools in that way, so many people in their lives are getting their sense of what's normal from that space, that those people are going to absorb it sort of secondhand by absorbing what are people talking about and thinking about who are on social media. It bleeds everywhere. And I made the case in my atomic collaboration video that the dragon uses polarization strategically for its own purposes. And of course, the algorithms are going to maximize engagement through maximizing this polarization, this reactive force, and the contempt different groups have for one another. But that also just happens to serve power really well. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why control over artificial intelligence is such a battleground in the current environment, is because artificial intelligence is the force that is sort of moving in the public discourse to shift the moral frame, in other words, also the economic frame. The second strategy the dragon has for influencing institutions of the heart relates to its control over pathways of upward mobility. So if we look at any arm of the dragon, like we're thinking about academia or public policy or Wall Street or corporate America or politics in general, Hollywood, publishing, any industry that is a huge industry of power, where power resides with that industry, it's going to have its own sociology. It's going to have its own moral frame, and there are going to be habits and patterns and expectations and norms that you have to develop if you want to move your way up inside that particular arm of the dragon. And the moral frame matters because those communities each have their own unique moral frame that will determine what gets enforced socially through admiration or contempt or scorn within that sociological community. And the fact that each of these is connected with power, each of these is one of the arms of the dragon that's sort of contending for power at the top. And sometimes there's an explicit nature to this. Like if you think of corporate culture, there's an intentional effort to make sure that that culture, those habits of the heart, those institutions of the heart, get adopted by as many people as possible in that organization. Now, how does the dragon influence official institutions? And this is primarily done through placement of people into key roles in the economy, in the structure. And when I say placement, this is going to use both money power and network power to place those people. Because obviously money can sort of buy certain roles. Money can also influence the social networks that have sticking power by creating spaces for people who are convenient to the dragon's purposes to get to know one another, to learn each other's values and absorb each other's values, all of that. And there are at least 3 strategic benefits for the dragon to place people, where one of these has to do with agenda setting power. Because, of course, the collective determination of the institutions are going to change, oftentimes officially, in meetings around boardrooms where people are voting on things or maybe coming to some consensus through conversation. How do we change the bylaws of this organization? How do we change the goal or the mission of this organization? Second, the placement of people strategically can influence the judgment calls about how to enforce certain rules rules that are officially written down. And then I don't have perfect language to describe this third strategy, so I'm going to call it operating in the crevices, where if you have like a 5,000-page piece of legislation that Congress is voting on, who is the person who actually writes that legislation? Now, the next institutional economics vocabulary that will help us understand the dragon strategy is going to be meta-institutions and sub-institutions. So institutions are inherently nested, and the best way to start thinking about this is to imagine a school system. So you might have the K through 12 school system that has its own set of rules and regulations that are official from the government, and underneath that you might have a school district, underneath that you might have a particular school, underneath that you have a particular classroom, and at every layer they have to pay attention to the rules, roles, and expectations at the layer above it. Now, I haven't even gotten to the very highest level of meta institution, which is concepts. That's the notion of what is a school? How does the population understand the role of teacher, the role of student, the structure of schools, and how it organizes itself around class periods and time periods? All of that is a meta structure. So the fourth strategy of the dragon is going to be to focus its energy at the very highest meta level of institution. And to explain this, I'm going to use the flipped classroom, which comes from my own experience. And to be clear, the dragon doesn't care one way or another about whether the flipped classroom becomes a thing. So this is dragon neutral. But you might imagine if you apply this example I'm going to give to other situations where the dragon may have more of a desire to bend things, that's how it works. So flipped classroom is basically a model of teaching where the professor puts out lectures in video form and the student's homework is to watch the lecture. Whereas what happens in the class is something interactive where the student is trying to apply it and the professor is a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage. That's the general model. And the whole reason I originally started YouTube was to try to do this. Now, my teaching strategy has evolved since then. It didn't actually work that well. There needs to be some kind of hybrid model. So I'm no longer a proponent of the flipped classroom in that exact format. But my point here is when I did that, I had to operate against people's expectations of what a classroom looked like. And the sage on the stage model is more what people expect. Because we live in a time that's sort of a little bit unstable socially and there's sort of high anxiety among students and all of that, there is a great comfort I find among students in the lecture format because they're used to it, they know what to expect, it's a little bit more controlled. So there's this desire to go along with what fits with the meta-level institution format of how to experience the classroom. And actually, coming out of the classroom in COVID, I think is a good example of this. Because I get the sense when I walked into a classroom that there was such a comfort just at the normalcy of being in a classroom with the teacher at the front in the way that students were used to for all of their lives. Because I think when the highest level meta institutions start to shift and change, that is really, really destabilizing for people. And COVID did a lot of shifting of these meta level institutions about how we expect our lives to play out, how we expect our institutions to work. And so because of that shifting nature, there was just a clinging, maybe even a clinging a little bit more strongly to the old normal expectations and institutions. And I felt that deeply in the classroom. And we might imagine if the dragon decided that actually it was more in its interest to bend education toward a flipped classroom model, the dragon would have an ability to sort of implement these expectations through Hollywood and through sort of upregulating things on social media that show people examples of the flipped classroom model. All of that could be upregulated to build something different into people's expectations about how a classroom operates. habits. Because honestly, part of the reason I could not implement that model was because I was working against people's expectations, and that creates conflict. And if we try to imagine a group of people who decide to start a business or a corporation that doesn't have the same values and norms and expectations as the current corporate world, when they hire people and bring people into their organization, they are going to have to operate against this corporate culture that has trained people's habits throughout their entire careers. And acting against that, fighting against those cultural norms, that takes so much effort. The fifth strategy of the dragon is to dissolve boundaries around lower level institutions. And at some point I need to do a video on boundaries. This is Elinor Ostron's book, Governing the Commons, and the Boundaries book. They're very helpful in thinking this through. But if you think about what might need to happen to eventually fight the dragon or change things, it's going to have to be some combination of a bottom-up effort where there's new institutions created by people who are not so embedded in the current power structure. And also, I do think there will have to be a top-down element that is not officially top-down. It's more like there are key players who are inside the power structures right now who are able to recognize these problems and work in a way that sort of connects with the bottom-up layer of things. But the way the dragon disempowers these bottom-up grassroots movements is oftentimes by dissolving their boundaries. In other words, their ability to form their own institutions with their own set of norms and expectations, etc. And an example of this might be the Braver Angels organization, which is a crossing the political divide organization that uses basically marriage counseling to try to bring together red people and blue people to converse across difference. And in doing so, the organization is trying to set its own set of different social norms that are not what you see in the online space. It's a great organization to fight polarization. But the problem is when people show up to these groups, they're bringing with them this huge amount of baggage about norms about how you treat the other person, norms about expectations for what to expect from those people, which they're going to probably feel as contempt toward them. There's all of this stuff built in. And if the leaders have to spend most of their time and energy and leadership skills fighting against that meta-level institution expectation sort of stuff, then there's not that much energy left to actually do a mission that is not just fighting against existing norms. And the same is true of a civic group or a farming collective or just a business startup that wants to set different social norms. They're going to have to spend a lot of energy fighting against the existing structure. And that doesn't leave much for their actual mission, their actual new set of institutions they're trying to form. And here's the way I visualize this. If we imagine the institutions and meta-institutions as these umbrellas, the highest level meta-institutions, which is often formed on social media, it's kind of raining down on the other institutions such that those institutions don't have strong boundaries around creating their unique thing. Rather, whatever comes inside these lower level institutions is sort of bleeding into it and making the boundary sort of amorphous. And maybe that analogy will not work until I actually do my boundaries video, but I'm just trying to convey one of the big strategies of the dragon is involved in disempowering lower level institutions. So I'm actually kind of curious, do you get the sense that these meta level institutions are shifting and changing in the 2020s? And do you have a sense that artificial intelligence and the digital space discourse is part of that shift? Is that something you feel? Or does it feel like that mostly stabilized after COVID?